Hello, this is Dr. Ross, and this is Building Blocks of the Nervous System. This presentation is for my class as well as Dr. Kemp's Anatomy and Physiology 1 course. So let's start talking about nerve tissue. So I want to start our discussion with the nervous system building blocks by starting small with the cells, and then we're going to build up to nerves and then ultimately look at how those nerves interact with each other, but in a very introductory way. So although the nervous system is very complex, nervous tissue basically consists of just two basic cell types, and that's neurons and glial cells. Neurons are both the structural and functional units of the nervous system. They transmit electrical signals, and the structure of a neuron is built to allow this transmission as well as through the cell as well as to other cells. So a neuron consists of several parts that contribute to this overall function. So first we have the cell body or soma. This is this large purple area. And this is basically the part of the cell that's going to contain the nucleus, as well as all the other organelles, just like many other cells in the body. Projecting from the cell body or the soma are the dendrites, and these receive nerve impulses from other neurons. So another neuron may interact with the dendrites of this neuron. As we work our way down from the soma or cell body toward the axon, we're going to come to the axon hillock. This is a region just before the axon where the plasma membrane will generate a nerve impulse, and that nerve impulse is going to travel down the axon. That's going to be our signal. So the axon itself is this region. It's a long extension of the cell body. It's continuous, so these are not separate structures. And it's insulated by these yellow areas, which are called a myelin sheath. All right, so the myelin sheath basically is there to increase the velocity of the electrical signal that's flowing down the axon, allowing it to propagate that signal very quickly. The myelin sheath consists of multiple layers, and it's mainly lipids with some protein. Now, these cells called neurolimocytes or Schwann cells are the cells that make up the myelin sheaths on the axon, and these are going to be the ones that make the myelin sheaths on the peripheral nervous system. In between these myelinated areas, you have what are called the nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier are basically gaps where there's no myelination, and in those gaps there's the cell membrane is enriched in ion channels, and the function of these is to increase the conduction of that nerve signal traveling down the axon. And this is called or referred to as saltatory conduction, and we're going to discuss saltatory conduction later. Finally, the axon will branch into telodendria at the end of the axon, and then at the end of each telodendria, they terminate in what's called an axon terminal. And this is the point where the neuron would communicate with another cell. So the axon terminal of this neuron may interact with the dendrite of another neuron. So here we're looking at two micrographs of nerve cells, and we can see they're both stained. So you can see that many of the features we just discussed on the previous slide are actually are visible using microscopy. So what we got here, you can see dendrites. You can also see the nucleus of the cell body. The axon hillock is very clear as well over on this left-hand image. Down near the bottom, you can see the nucleus of glial cells as well, and you can make out the axon. On the right-hand image is another micrograph where they have stained it so that you can see those nodes of Ranvier, and that's that little black or really dark area along that yellow axon in that micrograph. So you can classify neurons based on their structure, and there are three that we're going to discuss in this class. So most of the neurons in the central nervous system of vertebrates, including mammals like us, are multipolar. So a multipolar neuron has multiple processes that extend from the cell body, and the processes include both the dendrites as well as the axons. You can see the cell body on the left-hand side. There's multiple dendrites extending from that as well as a single long axon. So there are multiple things extending from this, making it multipolar. Now, a unipolar, or what's more realistically called a pseudo-unipolar neuron, is a type of neuron which has one extension from its cell body. So in this image here, this extension is coming out of the cell body, and then it's branching in two directions. So this is why this is really referred to as a pseudo-unipolar neuron. Basically, this type of neuron contains an axon that has split into two branches. One branch travels to the peripheral nervous system, and the other branch will travel to the central nervous system. And then there's a single process, which is where the unipolar part comes from, and that comes from the cell body. All right. Finally, we have the bipolar neuron. This is a type of neuron that has two extensions. Many bipolar cells are specialized sensory neurons for mammals, and so they transmit senses such as smell, sight, taste, hearing, or touch. And then a lot of times, or not a lot of times, but what happens to these cells sometimes during embryonic development is a pseudo-unipolar begins to form. So these pseudo-unipolar neurons actually start out as bipolar, but as they mature, they turn into these pseudo-unipolar neurons. We can also classify the neurons based on their function. So we have sensory neurons. Sensory neurons carry signals from sensory receptors to the central nervous system. So they may be carrying information about touch, for example. There are also interneurons. Interneurons connect one neuron to another, and therefore they relay signals, and they also make decisions in the central nervous system. And finally, we have motor neurons, which carry signals from the central nervous system to the effector organs. So they may carry muscle information that causes a muscle to contract. And we're going to discuss these three types of neurons when we talk about the spinal cord and the nerves later in this presentation. So keep these in mind as we move forward. Okay, so let's pause right here and put all this information together that we've already discussed. So let's talk about functional, anatomical, and structural types of neurons. All right, so starting functionally, we have sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are also called afferent neurons. These anatomically are going to be those neurons that are spinal or cranial nerves, and they transmit most senses as well as special senses. The typical ones are going to be unipolar, meaning they have cell bodies and one projection coming from that body, although as we've discussed, this is really pseudo-unipolar. And when we look at this later, you'll see that these cell bodies of these types of neurons are actually collected in an area called a ganglia, and we'll see that when we talk about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. Now, as I mentioned, some sensory nerves carry special sensory information, for example, the retina of the eye, and those are going to be the bipolar structural type of neuron. Interneurons are going to be found in the spinal cord and the brain, and these are also bipolar neurons structurally. And then motor neurons are also called efferent neurons. So the spinal and cranial nerves are going to be efferent neurons, and these are going to also include the autonomic nervous system, which we'll discuss later in this unit. And these types of, the structural types of these are typically multipolar neurons. So they're going to be multipolar. All right, so now what I want to do is move up a level. Let's talk about nerves, and then let's look at how the nerves interact with the spinal column or spinal cord, as well as how they interact with each other. So what we're looking at in this image is a nerve. And so what is a nerve? It's really just a bundle of axons that have been organized into groups. So what you can see here is the axon of one neuron. You can see the neurolimocytes, and you can see the endoneurium, which is the coating around each axon. So what happens next is those axons with their endoneurium are going to be bundled together, and those bundles are referred to as fascicles. And each fascicle is surrounded by a covering called a perineurium. This is very similar to the muscle fibers. Then what you take are several fascicles as well as the blood vessels, bundle those together, and you get a nerve. And then the nerve is covered in the epineurium. So a nerve is really just a bundle of fascicles, and a fascicle is a bundle of axons from a neuron. So now let's look at how the nerves interact with the spinal cord. And let's put this together. So in this image here, we're looking at a section of spinal cord and a spinal nerve. So the spinal cord is the main structure in the image, and it looks like it has a beige butterfly in the middle. Okay, so this is a cross section of spinal cord. So our spinal cord, of course, is a long tubular structure made of nervous tissue. Basically, it extends from the brainstem to the lumbar region of the vertebral column, and the function is to transmit nerve signals. And it's set up really well to do so. So starting with that butterfly-shaped area. The butterfly-shaped area is the gray matter, and it's made up mostly of the cell bodies of neurons. So remember the soma and the cell body of the neurons that I showed you in the very first image? Most of those are clustered together in the spinal cord toward the middle, and they make up this gray matter here, and it happens to be shaped like a butterfly. On the other hand, the white matter, which is the surrounding area, contains the axons of the nerves. And remember, most axons are myelinated, and the myelin is kind of a fatty substance, and that's what's giving the white matter this lighter appearance. Now, from the spinal cord, the nerves both exit and enter through the ventral and dorsal roots. So the dorsal root here, or posterior root, it's going to link up or emerge from the posterior part of the spinal cord, and it's going to travel to the dorsal root ganglion. So I mentioned ganglions earlier. A ganglion is a structure that contains the nerve cells, or the nerve cell bodies, and they kind of form this sort of swelling in the nerve fiber. You can see a couple of cell bodies in there, and this is where you have the bodies of the pseudo-unipolar neurons are all gathering together here. So to make room for all those cell bodies, there's going to be a swelling that occurs. So the dorsal root ganglia contain the pseudo-unipolar cell bodies of the nerve fibers. They travel from the ganglia, this area here, through the root and then into the spinal cord. The dorsal root transmits the sensory information, okay? So this is going to form the afferent sensory root of the spinal nerve. So we have sensory neurons that are sending information from external portions of the body, and I mean external to the spinal cord, is sending information to the spinal cord. Now, the other side is called the ventral or anterior root. It emerges from the anterior, or is connected to the anterior part of the spinal cord. Now, the cell bodies in this case are not in a ganglion. These cell bodies are located in the spinal cord's central gray area, that butterfly region. Remember, I said the butterfly region was mostly cell bodies. Well, they're the cell bodies of the nerves that are coming in through this ventral or anterior root. These are multipolar neurons. And they are going to leave the spinal cord, so they're going to travel from the cell body and leave the spinal cord via the ventral root, and they contain the efferent motor neurons. So they are sending out signal to cause motor or movement. Now, the signals are relayed between these afferent sensory neurons and efferent motor neurons by the interneurons. Okay, so the interneurons are found in the region of gray matter in the spinal cord. The last part of this image I want to focus on is the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve forms when the ventral root joins with the dorsal root. This happens outside of the vertebra, or outside of the spinal cord. And the spinal nerve carries both efferent and afferent neurons, and so we consider this to be a mixed nerve. In other images, in this presentation possibly, but definitely in others, you're going to be able to see how these spinal nerves actually exit the vertebral column through that intervertebral foramen. All right, so here we are, we're starting again. We can see the vertebra here, and you can see the spinal nerve as it's exiting the vertebra. Okay, shortly after it exits, it actually branches into 3 different rami. It branches into the posterior ramus, the ventral ramus, and the ramus communicans. So each of these 3 structures are going to carry both sensory and motor information. So the posterior or dorsal ramus, and ramus is singular, and I'm just talking about one right now, is a mixed nerve. It carries motor and sensory information to and from the skin and deep muscles of the back. You can kind of see those are innervating the back muscle right there. Next is the communicating rami or communicans, in this case the communicating ramus. This connects the spinal nerve to the sympathetic trunk, and we're going to talk more about the sympathetic trunk later. Then you have the ventral or anterior ramus, and basically this ramus is going to converge with other ventral rami to form a network of nerves called a nerve plexus, okay, which is shown in this image. So you can see this arrow pointing to one ventral ramus. You can see them coming from each, exiting each of the spinal nerves, and then they are going to merge with each other. So what this green area here is actually what's called the plexus. In this case, it's the brachial plexus, but there's more than one. So what in the world is a plexus? A plexus is just where fibers from the various ventral rami branch and become redistributed. And this is so that the nerves exiting the plexus has fibers from several different spinal nerves, all right? And this is a really big advantage because when you have a plexus, you have this mixing of the nerves from the different spinal nerves, and if you have a damage to a single spinal nerve, it's not going to completely paralyze one limb. So this is a really advantageous way to kind of mix these spinal nerves with each other. So once you exit the plexus, the nerves become called, it becomes the stuff exiting the plexus becomes called, is called the named nerves. These nerves are going to be named for the body regions that they innervate. So here you can see the axillary nerve, the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve. These are all the named nerves that are moving from this plexus. So let's talk about the plexus in a little bit more detail. So the spinal cord, there's 4 segments of the spine. Recall we've got the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral area of the spine. Now each space between the vertebra produces one spinal nerve, and it's going to be named for the segment of the spine that it comes from. So for example, cervical nerve number 3 is going to exit at C3. Now these spinal nerves are going to merge to form a plexus, and there are 4 plexus in the body, and then they're going to be resplit into the named nerves. Okay, so for example, the brachial nerve or the axillary nerve. So there are 4 plexuses, as I mentioned. You've got the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. Now, what you might be remembering is that there is a thoracic area of the spine. There is no thoracic plexus, and that's because in the thoracic region, those spinal nerves remain distinct from each other, and then they move on to innervate like a narrow strip of muscle or skin along your sides or your chest, your abdominal wall. And so they do something a little bit different once they exit the spine. But in the other areas, they all converge and form these plexus. So the last thing I want to talk about is the dermatome. So the dermatome is basically an area of skin that is supplied by those afferent nerve fibers from the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. Okay, so there are 8 cervical spinal nerves. The C1 does not have a dermatome associated with it. You've got your 12 thoracic nerves that have a dermatome, 5 lumbar, and 5 sacral nerves. So each of these nerves are going to relay sensation, including pain, from a particular region of the skin to the brain. So they're afferent. They're going to take information, sensory information from the area where the innervation is and transmit it back to the spinal cord and then back to the brain. So if you kind of look at these images, you can see that the dermatomes, at least along the thorax and the abdomens, the dermatomes are stacked sort of like discs. And they're each of these dermatomes is going to be supplied by a different spinal nerve. Now, when you get on the arms and legs, the pattern is a bit different. It runs more longitudinally along the limbs. And another interesting thing is that although the general pattern is similar in all people, the precise area of innervation is going to be unique. And some say it's as unique as a fingerprint. So what's the clinical relevance of this? So the clinical relevance is that symptoms that follow a dermatome, like a pain or a rash, may indicate a problem that involves a related nerve root. And this could be due to pain at the spinal cord or compression, or it could be due to a viral infection. So sometimes when you get a viral infection, you'll get lesions or a rash that orient along the dermatome. And one of those examples would be shingles. Another clinical relevance is referred pain. So referred pain is pain that is perceived at a location other than the site of the painful stimulus, meaning something is in pain, but you're perceiving that pain to come from somewhere else. Why does this happen? It's due to the fact that the sensory nerve fibers from one dermatome are going to come together at the same spinal cord level as the fibers from some viscera or organ. So for an example, this is why when you have a heart attack, it can often manifest itself as pain radiating along the arm because the sensory nerves from the heart as well as from that skin on the arm are going to converge at the same spinal cord level. Okay, and so that is it for this presentation. Thank you.